We have been extensively covering the Israeli war in Gaza from the start, and one major reason for that is that it's not just an Israeli war, but it's an American war as well. Just days after October 7th, Joe Biden flew to Tel Aviv and met with Prime Minister Netanyahu and vowed to do what America always does, which is provide Israel with all of the weapons it wants and needs from the American stockpile, and to finance Israel's war on top of the $4 billion that the United States gives to Israel every year. The United States and the Israelis are tied at the hip for all sorts of political reasons that we've covered before, and as a result, anytime Israel starts a new war or gets involved in a new war or is attacked, it becomes an American war as well. The United States already is involved in combat in the Middle East. It has been attacking the Houthis in retaliation for the Houthis' attack on commercial shipping, which in turn was retaliation for the destruction of Gaza by Israel. The United States has repeatedly bombed sites in Syria and Iraq that it claims are linked to Iran. The United States immediately deployed significant military assets right after October 7th in order to deter escalation either with Hezbollah or with Iran. So the United States has been deeply involved in this new MidEast war from the very beginning, just like we always are involved whenever Israel has a new war. But what is happening now is an escalation of the exact kind that has been most concerning from the start, namely a direct military conflict between Israel on the one hand and Iran on the other. And the proximate cause of that potential war is the fact that back on April 2nd, as this AP article reminds us, Israel decided to do something that countries almost never do. They bombed a consulate of another country. They bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. And they killed 2 generals and 5 other officers. Now, we reported at the time, when we reported on this, we described how extraordinary it is for a country to bomb another country's embassy. Embassies are considered sacred and inviolable. That's the only way that you could have embassies in other countries. And we talked about the fact that Julian Assange was inside the Ecuadorian embassy in London, basically an apartment building, for 8 years. And while he was in there, he was publishing with WikiLeaks all kinds of leaks of classified documents that the United States government believed were damaging to United States security. They knew exactly where Assange was. All they had to do was just go get him, have the British police go get him. And yet, because he had asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, which is considered Ecuadorian soil, and embassies are considered by all civilized countries to be places that you can't enter, the United States did not invade that embassy, nor did the UK until Ecuador permitted it when they withdrew asylum. An even more extreme case that we covered was in 1984, when the Libyan embassy in London was used by a shooter inside the Libyan embassy. He was shooting at anti-Gaddafi protesters, wounding many of them, and he actually killed a British police officer. That was a case where the Libyan embassy was actually used as a staging ground to shoot and kill people, including a British police officer, on the streets of London. And there too, the British did not invade the consulate, the embassy where the Libyans were. In part, it was strategic because the Libyans immediately surrounded the British consulate in Libya to make sure that they basically have leverage, but also because countries don't just go violate embassies. But Israel decided that it could, just like it decides that it can do essentially anything, because it has the world's richest and most powerful country standing behind it no matter what it does. Here from the AP, quote, an Israeli airstrike that demolished Iran's consulate in Syria on Monday killed 2 Iranian generals and 5 officers, according to Iranian officials. The strike appeared to signify an escalation of Israel's targeting of military officials from Iran, which supports militant groups fighting Israel in Gaza and along its border with Lebanon. Now, just let's use our common sense. That embassy, that consulate in Syria is deemed to be Iranian soil. If Israel goes and bombs it as they did, it is inevitable. There's a 100% chance that Iran will retaliate in a significant way. No country would allow their embassy to be bombed by a foreign country and do nothing. Of course, the Israelis understood that they were provoking a retaliatory response. And that's exactly what is going to happen. Intelligence has been beeping and blinking for 2 weeks now that the Iranians are preparing a very significant imminent attack, probably not against U.S. targets, but against Israeli ones in the region. And of course, that's the only thing Iran could do. Their embassy was blown up and senior officials were killed when Israeli bombed it. Here from the New York Times today, U.S. targets unlikely to be on the list in possible Iranian attack, officials say. Quote, in anticipation of the Iranian strikes, several countries, including the United States, issued new guidelines to their citizens about travel in Israel and the surrounding region. So yet again, it's now more dangerous for American citizens to travel in the world because of what Israel has done. Quote, American intelligence analysts and officials said on Friday that they expect Iran to strike multiple targets inside Israel within the next few days in retaliation for an Israeli bombing in the Syrian capital on April 1st that killed several senior Iranian commanders. The United States, Israel's preeminent ally, has military forces in several places across the Middle East, but Iran is not expected to target them in order to avoid a direct conflict with the United States, according to U.S. and Iranian officials who spoke anonymously about intelligence gathered on the expected attacks, which they were not publicly authorized to discuss. Any Iranian strike inside Israel would be a watershed moment in the decades of hostilities between the two nations. I think Israel destroying an Iranian embassy, it was a pretty watershed moment as well. But the New York Times says that would be the watershed moment when Iran retaliates. It would be a severe escalation of hostilities between the two nations that would most likely open a volatile new chapter in the region. Israel and Iran do not maintain any direct channels of communication, making the chances far greater that each side could misread the other's intentions, and an Iranian attack would heighten the risk of a wider conflict that could drag in multiple countries, including the United States. So, in sum, there's a very good likelihood that we're about to have a new, serious Middle East war that will drag the United States in. In remarks to reporters on Friday, President Biden said that he expected a military attack against Israel, quote, sooner rather than later. And when asked what his message was to Iran, he said, don't. Quote, we are devoted to the defense of Israel, he added. We will support Israel. We will help defend Israel, and Iran will not succeed. So he's making a statement that if the Iranians retaliate against Israel and that causes an open conflict, the United States, using American combat troops and soldiers and service members, will involve itself in this new MidEast war in order to side with Israel. Here is President Biden speaking today, just earlier today, on this question.
Mr. President, to Iran in this moment.
Don't.
Are American personnel and assets at risk, Mr. President? Mr. President, are American troops at risk as well?
Just to be clear, the question there was, are American troops at risk as well? And here's what Biden said.
We are devoted to the defense of Israel. We will support Israel. We will help defend Israel, and Iran will not succeed. Thank you very much.
What would trigger a direct U.S. response, sir?
So maybe you want the United States to be involved in a new Middle East war. Maybe you don't. But clearly the string of events here is that the Israelis knew they were doing something that would almost require, that not almost would require, that would require a serious act of retaliation militarily by Iran. No country could tolerate having their embassy deliberately blown up and do nothing. Here at the press conference at the Pentagon today, the Pentagon spokesman gave an even clearer answer than Joe Biden did, which anyone who speaks basically gives a clearer answer than Joe Biden. But just in case you thought that was just Biden muttering things impetuously, here was the much more prepared Pentagon press conference where the spokesman was asked about whether the U.S. would get involved in this new war.
If Iran is to strike a target inside Israel, and would the You've talked a lot about the ironclad, commitment to Israel. Would the Pentagon be obliged to join in to respond?
Yeah, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. Again, I've highlighted our ironclad commitment to Israel's security.
And then on a different topic.
So when you say I've highlighted our ironclad commitment to U.S. security, that is pretty much of a clear answer as you can get. So the question is, why is it that, and this is the question I asked from the very beginning when the U.S. decided to finance and arm Ukraine in its war against Russia. Why is it in the interest of the American people, American citizens, that's supposed to be the first priority of the U.S. government when making decisions? How would American citizens benefit from a new Middle East war triggered by the decision of the Israelis to bomb the Iranian embassy, the Iranian consulate in Damascus? I understand it would benefit Israel, for sure, but Israel's a foreign country. It's not the same country as the United States. It would definitely benefit Israelis who would not want the United States, the richest, most powerful country, intervening in all of your wars on your side whenever you decide to bomb another country. Maybe that's the reason why countries backed by the United States do so. In fact, there's a lot of reporting that President Zelensky always knew he couldn't enter a new war with Russia because Ukraine has no chance of defeating Russia. Russia is a much bigger country, has way more soldiers, has way more military might, and that's why he always wanted a diplomatic solution. But at the start of the war, when he was entering diplomacy with Putin and with the Russians, Joe Biden dispatched Boris Johnson, this is now very well reported, and basically told Zelensky, we don't want you to engage in diplomacy, and don't worry, we, the West, NATO, the United States, will provide you with all the weapons you need. We will give you everything. We will back you all the way until the end, for as long as necessary. And that's what then emboldened Zelensky to think that he could fight Russia. Oh, well, I have the United States and NATO behind me. It's going to be not just Ukraine, but all of these powerful countries giving me the most sophisticated military weaponry. And that's when he decided maybe it was worth it to do. So if you go and tell a country, don't worry, we're always going to defend you. We're always going to go to war for you. We're always going to give you everything you want. We're going to pay for your wars. What do you think the effect is going to be? Obviously, it will be to embolden those countries to believe that they can more easily fight in wars. On April 3rd, so a little over a week ago, we had on the foreign policy expert, Professor John Mearsheimer, and it was just a day or two after the Israelis bombed the Iranian embassy in Damascus. And I asked him what he thought was likely to happen, and listen to what he said. What are the kinds of things that Iran could do or might do in order to retaliate, something it seems like they almost have to do, and what are the possible implications of that for the United States?
Well, the fact is that the Iranians don't want a war with the United States. They've been trying to avoid a war with the United States. They've gone to great lengths to communicate to us that they don't want a war. And of course, we don't want a war with them either. When we first put those two aircraft carriers and the other naval ships into the Mediterranean Sea, it was not so much to protect Israel. I mean, there was some of that at play, but it was mainly to make sure that the war didn't escalate and we didn't get dragged in. We don't want to get dragged into any wars in the Middle East. We're already fighting the Houthis. That's bad enough. But we don't want a war against Hezbollah, and we certainly don't want a war against Iran. And I think what's going on here, as I alluded to before, is I think the Israelis would like to get us into a war with Iran. And I don't think the Israelis would mind it at all if they got into a war with Hezbollah. And in fact, in the early months of the war, there was lots of evidence, at least in the newspapers, that the United States was telling the Israelis that they could not start a war with Hezbollah because there was evidence the Israelis actually wanted to go to war with Hezbollah. They wanted to deal with that problem militarily. As you well know, the Israelis believe in big stick diplomacy. They believe that they can beat other groups or other countries over the head with a big stick and get their way. It hardly ever works, but that's their sort of modus operandi. And I think they wanted to pick a fight for a number of months there with Hezbollah, not only to punish Hezbollah, but I think they also saw as an opportunity to do ethnic cleansing on the West Bank. I think the Israeli view deep down is that the bigger the war is, the greater the opportunity for ethnic cleansing, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank as well. And as you know, that's their ultimate objective, to cleanse the Palestinians out of both of those two pieces of real estate.
There was a lot of reporting right after October 7th in the Israeli press, worried that Netanyahu wanted a war with Hezbollah as well, that he wanted to expand the war, not just from Gaza, but also to go to the Israeli-Lebanese border and to fight a war with Hezbollah. And in fact, the forces of Hezbollah and the IDF have been exchanging low-level munitions and gunfire and missiles occasionally over the last 6 months, but it has not escalated into a major war, in part because, as Professor Mearsheimer said, Iran actually wants to avoid a war. One of the things that I think is so important to realize is that when you're an American citizen and you spend most of your time listening to American media, it's so easy to become convinced that all these countries are pure evil and we're just pure good and we and our allies are innocent victims. The evil Russians invaded poor little Ukraine with no provocation from the West, from the United States of any kind. It was just Putin overnight turned into a Hitler and decided he wanted to go conquer countries. And then we, of course, have the similar narrative about China, even though China has not fought a war since 1979, while the United States has fought more than you can count since then. And then you have Iran as well, that doesn't actually go around invading other countries. It has militias in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon in its neighborhood. All places the United States has forces as well. The difference is Iran is actually invited by the government of Syria to be there, whereas the Americans aren't. But in general, Iran does not go around seeking wars. But I know that's kind of shocking to hear because no, actually, we're supposed to believe that it's not Israel and the United States being antagonistic and aggressive and militaristic in the United States, it's Iran. And so often you hear people saying, we need to end this posture of endless wars. We have to stop going to wars for foreign interests. The only wars we should fight are when countries are actually attacking our own country and threatening our homeland and our borders. And yet every time the military-industrial complex, the entity that wants a posture of endless war, presents a new war to the American public, it's very easy to get the American public riled up with hatred and anger that the new country that we're supposed to go to war with is the epitome of all evil. We've gone through before how many countries in the last 25 years were described as the new Hitler by major American media outlets and by leading American politicians as well. It's a demonization campaign that works every time. So here we have a new war that could very well have been started because of Israel's extraordinarily rare decision to bomb the Iranian embassy, and now we're going to be told that we have to go to war in the Middle East yet again to defend Israel because Israel is the innocent victim and Iran is the aggressor. And this is the narrative, the script that Americans are worked up into accepting in every new war. It was the same thing that happened with the war in Ukraine. And it's the same thing that has happened in the war in Syria and the war in Libya and the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and the war in Vietnam and the war in Central America. So many wars, in fact, most wars are sold through that narrative. And it's very important to see what actually happened here, how this actually started, whose interest it is to have this war, and especially how they can make sure that the United States is dragged into it, even though there's no country threatening Americans. We may very well be in a position where we're about to send American soldiers to fight and die for a war that is so plainly not the United States' war to fight. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.